quick intro. So Nicola Galloway, welcome. Thank you so much coming to us from the University of Glasgow. And so I don't want to make anything up or go off the cuff here. So I have my introduction right here. So Nicola joined the School of Education in October of 2020 as a senior lecturer and program director for the Master of Science Medical TESOL program. So from 2012 to 2020, she was a lecturer in TESOL at the University of Edinburgh, where she coordinated courses on curriculum design, global Englishes, and research methods. You can find Nicola's entire profile, and I will tell you it's quite extensive. It's great reading. You can find her entire profile on the University of Glasgow website, as well as ResearchGate. She's also there. And more specifically, her research interests focus on language teaching research and the globalization of the English language. So without further ado, won't take up too much more time. Nicola, take it away.
Thanks, Wayne. Let me just share my screen. Well, firstly, it's lovely to meet everyone, and thanks again to the organisers for inviting me along to the JALT conference. When I was an English teacher in Japan for over 10 years, I think it was, I attended the JALT conference every year, so it's very nice to be back as one of the plenary speakers. I feel a little nervous knowing that this is your first plenary of the conference, but I am very glad that it's at 11 o'clock UK time, not 6 in the morning. I'm a little bit nervous about Monday morning. But thanks again for inviting me to speak on this topic. I have moved the inverted commas. I noticed on the website that they were around TESOL, but today I'm going to reflect on the so-called traditional TESOL curricula based on native speaker norms in light of the flourishing research in the global Englishes paradigm, where the majority of my work is located. So I'll explore movements towards innovating the ELT or the TESOL curriculum in light of the globalisation of English. And in doing so, I'll highlight similarities in proposals for TEAL, Teaching English as an International Language, World English is Informed ELT, Elf-Aware Pedagogy. I mean, this is academia. We like new terminology, and also GALT, Global English is Language Teaching. And I'll give definitions of those and also particularly of Global Englishes. Despite the barriers to implementing change in ELT curricula, predominantly attachments to a so-called standard and native English, particularly in testing and materials, and I'll cover these in the talk, there has been an increased recognition of the need for change in the field. And in recent years, I've been delighted to see a considerable amount of classroom-based studies, as well as studies in teacher education. And I'll examine some of this empirical research that's looked at how to innovate the ELT curriculum and ELT practitioner education. And I'll draw on a recent systematic review that I published with my colleagues Jim Mckinley and Heath Rose in language teaching. So this research is giving us it's given us more indications now of what this new approach to ELT in the 21st century should look like. The field's been criticised in the past of a theory-practice divide, and that was really what sparked my interest in this topic as well. So it's helping really to bridge this theory-practice divide then. Recent work on technological innovations, obviously, is also growing. And I suspect that this will grow even more with moves towards online and hybrid forms of teaching. I was delighted to find out yesterday that I will be finally going back face-to-face from mid-January, hopefully. I've been working in my living room for, oh, goodness knows how long now. I started my new job at Glasgow last October, and I've only visited the campus once and met one colleague in person. So it'll be really nice just to start meeting people that I'm working with. So to begin with, I'll focus then on the need for a paradigm shift in the field of ELT, drawing on global Englishes research. And as I mentioned, I'll draw on work in the different fields that share a similar underlying ideology. I thought it would be helpful just to introduce myself. So who am I? And why am I interested in this topic? So as I mentioned, I started my career teaching English in Japan. I was working out in Gunma-ken, initially in a very rural village in Namokumura. I don't know if anyone here knows of it. It's near Shimonita Machi. Very, very small school, very rural. And as I was there, I started really to question my role as an English teacher, but also my students' use of English as well, their target interlocutors. I became very interested in the diversity in English. I obviously am from Scotland, and I was given a CD to try and sound more American. My spelling was corrected on the blackboard into American spelling, and I just became fascinated with this. So I returned to do a master's in TESOL, where I focused on linguistic imperialism and the JET program. And then I continued this work in global linguistics, again, working in Japan, where I introduced a World Englishes course in the university that I was working in, and I focused on Japanese students' attitudes towards English and how raising their awareness of the diversity of English and the use of English as a global lingua franca could perhaps influence these attitudes as well. And I've continued my interest in this topic ever since. Since leaving Japan and taking up post at Edinburgh, I did get quite concerned about becoming disengaged with classroom practice. So my work has focused more in recent years on teacher education. So I've introduced a global Englishes course at Edinburgh. I teach in a Which English course at the University of Glasgow. And from January, I'll introduce a new Teaching English as an International Language course, and there's quite a lot of research projects that will be on the back of these as well. I'm engaged in quite a lot of different projects, more recently related to EMI as well, and I'll draw on some of that work in today's talk. I just wanted to include some statistics here. So as I mentioned, I was a JET. And we can see here that the majority of those working on this program still continue to be native English speakers, despite the use of English as a global language. We do, however, see headway being made on Masters in TESOLs and Applied Linguistics programs. I've just given some examples here. Now, this is not inclusive. I just chose a few from different contexts, but we can see that universities around the world now are including global English as subject matter, and I've added the University of Glasgow here as well now. I've published my work in global English now quite extensively, and it's really good to see that it is gathering momentum, this field as well. And I've endeavoured to try and publish in both, research-focused outlets, but also practitioner-orientated journals. And that's something that I'll focus on at the end as well. Not just, we keep hearing this word impact in academia, influence policy and pedagogical uptake, but really, we want to work with practitioners, and we want our research to reach practitioners as well. One of the ways that I've done this as well is to work with the University of Tokyo to develop a series of MOOCs. The first one was on EMI for faculty development, and the second one was on the relevance of global Englishes for EMI, which I really enjoyed making. I was also awarded a JSPS fellowship to come to Japan later in the year to continue this work with Todai on faculty development. I have had to cancel, however, though, just with quarantine and current restrictions. So that's a bit of a shame that we're not able to undertake this project, but the MOOCs were really successful. And I just wanted to show you the first one. It's just a little 2-minute promo video, but oh, it's not letting me click on the link. Why is that? Oh, that's a shame. Oh well. Anyway, you'll have these slides afterwards. It wasn't letting me click there. It's just a little 2-minute intro video, but it was also on the global spread of English, which I thought would be quite interesting for today. I'm also delighted to announce that my colleague Ali Selvi and I have recently signed a contract for a new Routledge Handbook of Teaching English as an International Language. We haven't started yet, but it will be quite a big volume that will bring together the work in teaching English as an international language, World Englishes, ELF, Global Englishes, that focuses on the need for change in ELT curricula. Okay, so that's a little bit about me. So we saw then, we didn't see, because I was going to show you the MOOC video there about the global spread of English, but English is undeniably today the world's global language. Other major languages have existed in history: Arabic, Latin, Sanskrit. They've all had their days of power and dominance, but none of them have achieved the status of English. English has more non-native speakers of English than native speakers, a key point. The majority of speakers around the world now are adding to their multilingual repertoire. It's a global language. It's a contact language spoken by more non-native speakers than native English speakers in a variety of contexts, in a variety of domains, more and more frequently, particularly with the global spread towards EMI and higher education, which I'll keep mentioning today because I'm doing a lot of work in this field. It's called the international language of a variety of domains, so business, science, politics, and the academic world, journalism, travel, internet, global press. What cannot be denied is that what is taught in the traditional ELT curriculum in the classroom is not reflective today of how the language is being used outside of the classroom as a global lingua franca. Of course, there's been speculations over the future role of English. We saw in the UK in the run-up to Brexit, we had a lot of headlines. Will Brexit spell the end of English as official EU language? English could be ditched as an official language of the European Union after Brexit. The EU could drop English as their official language. You know, this was covering the newspapers. This didn't happen. And you know, a lot will argue that English will continue to dominate due to its status as a global language. And you know, the EU did confirm that it will continue to have an official status. But despite these debates, what cannot be denied is that the common use of English today is a global lingua franca. And this is not something that's going away, despite the growth in other major languages. So it's a contact language, a lingua franca, a language influx. So I keep repeating myself here, but all of these are key points for points that I'll return to later in the talk when we look at this much needed paradigm shift in the field away from native English speaker norms towards a more inclusive approach to teaching English as an international language. So the use of English then as a global language, as I mentioned, is even more apparent when we look at the growth of EMI in higher education around the world. It's been referred to as a galloping phenomenon, pandemic in proportion. McCarroll's used, you know, the metaphor of a Shinkansen. It's going at such an unprecedented speed. All we can do is ensure that the passengers get off at each station carefully. It's been referred to as being the most significant trend in higher education in non-Anglophone contexts in the 21st century. The growth rates are really phenomenal. EMI is a growing field of research. We've got research centres like the University of Oxford, the online network that I coordinate, but provision is still rapidly outpacing research in this field. So here we see some growth rates in Europe. In just 10 years, we had a 1,115% increase in EMI programmes. And EMI has now spread beyond the traditional hotspots of Europe to more emerging EMI contexts, such as, you know, China and Japan, where it's heavily associated also with English proficiency goals. So just like in Brexit, however, it is important to note, though, that there has been a backlash towards EMI and the use of English in higher education in certain contexts, such as Africa, the Gulf, Europe, and Malaysia. And this has led my colleagues and I in a forthcoming article in Language Teaching just to conclude that nonetheless, the findings from this study, sorry, I can't read this because I can see the I can see myself and the presenters. Let me try and get rid of that there. I'm going to just hide the thumbnail so that I can see the full screen. Nonetheless, the findings from this study highlight a contradiction between research in the field of ELT and on-the-ground EMI practices. Global English's research is challenging linguistic imperialism, monolingual interpretations of EMI that favour English-only instruction, and the native speaker teacher may be promoting it. This finding underscores the need for research, not only to investigate EMI in practice, so we need much more research at the ground level, but also to address how to combat the dominant constraints and attitudes, such as through teacher training problems. So we see here that standard language ideology, monolingual ideologies, native speakerism has all been challenged within the field of ELT, but alongside we have this growth in EMI promoting monolingual ideologies, which is something I've become quite interested in and also concerned in. Anyway, this talk is not about EMI, it's about global Englishes. So I'm just going to move that there so I can see the thumbnail again. So you think I'd be used to Zoom presenting by now. Okay, so as English has spread then beyond its original boundaries and is increasingly used on a global scale, and just as I demonstrated there, more so, increasingly so in the educational domain, related fields of research within applied linguistics have emerged to document the use of English globally, how it manifests itself, and also more recently, how it should be taught. It's given rise to a number of interrelated conceptualizations of English as a global language. So we've got world Englishes, English is a lingua franca, English is an international language. Researchers within these fields position their work within different fields, but have grouped these shared endeavours under the broad term of global Englishes. So global Englishes is seen as an inclusive field, an umbrella term that highlights the similar underlying ideologies and also calls for change from researchers in all of these fields. Global English's researchers highlight the pluricentricity of English use, and they showcase how English is adapted and used alongside other languages. As May notes, multilingualism, it seems, is the topic du jour, at least applied in critical linguistics. And Global Englishes is very much part of this work, and it consolidates work in the related fields of the multilingual turn in SLA and also translanguaging as well. So it's an inclusive term. This is in our Global Englishes for Language Teaching book. We have a detailed definition of this here. So again, we can just see the interrelated fields of EIL, World Englishes, ELF, and also how it resonates with work going on with the multilingual turn and translanguaging. So as I mentioned then, researchers in these fields position their work within different fields, but they do share a similar underlying ideology. They focus on English as a pluricentric notion, focus on the use of English by non-native speakers, the global ownership of the language, and the work helps inform the sociolinguistic challenges of a globalized world. And researchers in all of these fields have highlighted the implications of their research for English language teaching. And this is a real key point here. So moving on then to the pedagogical implications of the global spread of English. So we do see that research is gathering momentum. We've got a number of World Englishes, Global Englishes and ELF book sections and chapters on ELT now in TESOL. We've had whole conferences dedicated to this topic, entire books now on the pedagogical implications of the globalisation of English, articles in language teaching journals on ELF, World Englishes, and also in the field of TESOL as well. However, despite the increase in such research, if we walk into a bookshop, we still see a lot of books like this, particularly in the Japanese context. So mistakes that Asians mistakes, this idea that non-conformity to native English norms is a mistake or an error. And this is clearly not having a very positive impact on the self-confidence of non-native speakers of English. So Global English language teaching is very much about emancipating non-native speakers from rigid, static native speaker norms. You know, I've got books like Native to Raku Raku Hanasuru Eikai. I haven't spoken or read Japanese for such a long time. Yeah, quiz sono eigo native wa ni wa koi kikoimasu. So I mean, this is really concerning. I mean, who cares how our English sounds to a native English speaker if that's not going to be our students' target interlocutor? The majority of speakers today are using English as a global lingua franca. Yet in the classroom, we're still preparing them to use the language with a minority group of native English speakers. We do see in the field of teacher education and TESOL, now I haven't done any detailed research, I've only just started to look here, but I've just been interested in the general, the course books that we're using on our applied linguistics and TESOL programs, and I started to have a look into these and the coverage of global Englishes. In this book on materials, we do see a recognition of ELF, you know, as a phenomenon. There's even references here to ELF researchers. And the authors even state this new perspective of ELF has implications for all aspects of ELT, which I thought, great, wow. And that's just forgotten about in the remainder of the book. Another one was also materials. Again, recognition. ELF requires a reconceptualization of appropriate goals in ELT, appropriate cultural content, and a change in materials design. The authors note the logic of the need for such change in materials is inescapable, but he wonders whether this will encourage a publisher to dare to be different. As we know, ELT is a money-making industry. I'd like to hope that daring to be different and offering something that really is preparing students to use English as it's used today would encourage someone to dare to be different and would actually boost sales rather than have a negative impact on them. So we do see increased recognition then in this field of ELF as both a phenomenon and also global English's research, but it's not enough just to mention this on the blurb on the back of a book or at the start of the book, that, you know, this needs to be incorporated into, you know, the entire book. It is important to note that these discussions of the diversity of English and the dominance of native English in TESOL are not new. I mean, I'm sure there's been plenaries from 2030. I don't know how long JALT's been going. I'm trying to think. I was in Japan from 2001 to 2012, I think. 12, 13, 12. I'm sure you've had plenaries before discussing similar issues. Scholars in the field of applied linguistics have long lobbied for more accurate representation of the variation in English and language learning context, and I've given some examples here. But global English's research and the growing research in this field does throw new perspectives on these issues, particularly the fact that today multilingualism, not monolingualism, is the norm. This increasing body of research is showcasing how the language is constantly in a state of flux, that there's no clear boundaries today between languages, that English is used in dynamic and multifaceted ways, and that learners will have to use languaging, navigate multilingual encounters. You know, we need to give them a sense of agency, and that they're very creative when they're using language outside of the classroom. But ultimately, it's showcasing the irrelevance of a curricula based on static native English norms for the majority of English language learners today. And it's also highlighting the inherent discrimination that we continue to see in language school recruitment. I just went yesterday to the ECC website, and I could see here again, you know, it's links to apply in America, apply in Canada. I've included some job advertisements I have found here that aren't just asking for a native English speaker, but a Caucasian teacher requested, and we see more of a call for Eastern European teachers as well. So that this is really clearly something that we've been trying to address for a long time, but it is still happening. In the field of EMI, I'm going to keep coming back with EMI examples. My colleague Rachel Rugg and I have a forthcoming article in System, and it's focused on the EMI teacher. And we found in the JREC, this was actually a website I used to use when I was looking for jobs in Japan. Out of 289 job advertisements, 26 positions required native or native-like proficiency in English. So I do think this is a real concern with the emergence of EMI in higher education and non-Anglophone contexts, that we're going to see not just a resurgence of standard language ideology, native speakerism, but these are ideologies that we're trying to address in the fields of ELT and global Englishes, but we see this happening in EMI. And we found that more positions in Japan were requiring applicants to be so-called proficient in English than the ones we looked at in China. And again, this notion of proficiency or competence in English is quite controversial, and one that we need to unpack as well. What does it mean today to be a proficient English speaker? Does it mean being a native English speaker? Does it mean being a successful user of English as a lingua franca? But then what would that look like, and how would we test that? So I am aware that there's barriers, and I'll come back to that. So ultimately then, Global Englishes research highlights the need for ELT curricula that recognises the role of English as a global language. The evidence is there, but the curricula continues to be misaligned, and we continue to see job advertisements like this. So as I mentioned at the start, the field has been criticised for this theory-practice divide, and this is what I started problematising when I started my PhD back in, I think, maybe 2008. I started to explore the field. It seemed to me that at the theoretical level, a lot of scholars, like I am today, were calling for change, but not telling teachers, and I was an English teacher at the time, what to do. So there was a lot of discussion in the literature that what we were doing was wrong. We weren't preparing our students to use English as a lingua franca. A number of proposals were being made, but there was nothing really at the classroom level. So I started my work by what we've now termed the JALT proposals, and we had 6 of these, and it was really a literature consolidation, if you like, of what was being called for in the literature. So the first one was to increase students' awareness to the diversity of English, emphasize respect for multilingualism, raise their awareness, so having this critical perspective of the global spread of English, their awareness of how successful ELF users are functioning using English as a lingua franca. How are they engaging? How are they accommodating? Is it paraphrasing, repetition? How are they drawing on their multilingual repertoires? We know that, as I mentioned, what we're teaching our students in the classroom and what we're presenting to them in our curricula is not representative of how English is functioning outside of the classroom. And we have that growing evidence base, particularly within the field of English as a lingua franca. So what is it that these speakers are doing to successfully communicate? Emphasize respect for diverse English-speaking communities, and also the real need to change hiring practices as well. Over the last 12 years or so then, I've been involved in a number of studies, initially Japan-based studies at the classroom level, and as I mentioned, more recently in teacher education, as I've left the classroom and moved into teacher education. So a number of studies have been conducted on how to explore putting this into practice. So we have seen scholars start to address this theory-practice divide in the field, and recent years in particular have seen a considerable amount of classroom-based research in language teacher education. So this prompted my colleagues and I to do a systematic review for language teaching of, well, what's happening in the field and what do these innovations look like? How are they being conducted? And what further research do we need in the field as well? So it was a really enjoyable publication to do, actually, just because obviously I started my own career in this field with an innovation in Japan. So it was really interesting just to see how this has taken off and how different people in different contexts are trying to introduce global Englishes related innovations. So many of the studies that I'll report on today are taken from this, I've got 30 minutes, that's good. We reviewed 58 empirical articles that were published between 2010 and 2020. And 38 of these were given an in-depth critical review. Our main conclusion was that there is a lack of longitudinal designs in this area. There's an underuse of direct measures to explore the effects of classroom interventions. A lot of these studies were claiming that the intervention had an effect, but they didn't have the research methodology to back this up. There was also an underrepresentation of contexts outside of university classrooms, and I don't think there was any work in elementary school as well. And obviously, as we know, stereotypes form very young. And all of these act as a barrier to innovation. And I'll return to this notion of barriers to innovations at the end of the talk. So we also revealed in the systematic review then that there's a real need for more robust methodological designs. Research in this field has certainly started, but methodologically, a lot of these studies were flawed in some ways. I'm not criticizing the studies in any way whatsoever. It was a systematic review which included the research methodology, but my aim with this critique overview of the research that's been conducted is to help inform the field and also ultimately to instigate this shift away from native norms. So there's a need for more robust methodological designs which measure both the effects of global English's content on teacher beliefs, on student attitudes, and also pedagogical practices, both before and also throughout programs as well, but also after teachers return to the classroom. And I've just had some funding approved to do this with my own students at Glasgow to develop an alumni strand to a network that I'll talk about in detail on Monday at the workshop, and just to work with the students once they graduate and go home to their home context. Anyway, I'll return to these studies later. So as I mentioned at the start then, all of the major schools of scholarship within the field of global Englishes have lobbied for transformation in language teaching practices. And these have culminated in articulated models for change. And here I'll introduce 4 prominent models. So the first then, World Englishes Informed, ELT, which has obviously been instrumental in raising our awareness of the diversity of English. Notions of World Englishes Informed ELT have their origins in the early applied work from the field and from the late Raj Kakru. Since the 1980s, so for over 4 decades now, World English scholars have been calling for this paradigm shift in language pedagogy. Back in 1992, we had Kakru's well-cited 6 fallacies about the users and uses of English, and this offered a concise critique on these incorrect assumptions underpinning ELT, which unfortunately still exist. Almost 2 decades later, Matsuda and Friedrich were critical. They were still critical then of discussions that were still largely at an abstract level in the field. So this theory-practice divide. They were criticizing scholars for not providing adequate research-informed pedagogic ideas for people to use in the classroom. So in response to this, they created the EIL curriculum blueprint. And this gave specific guidance. So we see this movement towards addressing this theory-practice divide. More recently, these ideas were articulated into a framework for TEOL, and this was a model built on the theoretical foundations of World English's informed ELT, so very much based from World English's. By the early 2010, I mean, really early 2000s, but the field of ELF, and so that first decade, had been very influential and somewhat controversially and subject to a lot of criticism, but very influential in lobbying for change in ELT and building on the influential groundwork of key ELF scholars. There's so many acronyms and terminology. Martin Dewey introduced his post-normative approach to curriculum change. So much like Kumaravadavelu's post-methods approach to methodology, this was a post-normative approach to curriculum to curriculum change. So it sought to heighten teachers' awareness of ELF. And there's been a lot of focus on teacher education in the field of ELF. Martin and his colleagues have argued that this is a real essential first step in instigating what they term ELF-orientated change in pedagogic practice. So we see this related then to this post-methods era of teaching. This awareness could help teachers to inform innovative teaching approaches that are appropriate and context specific. So that it's not, just like it's not one method for every context, it's not one English norm, if you like, that we have to adapt based on our students' needs and our students' contexts. And I think this is a real key point to make here. So as I mentioned then, a lot of ELF scholarship has focused on raising teachers' awareness, and particularly through ELF-centred teacher education. And a lot of this work's been conducted by Yasmin Beirut and Nikos Sifikis. He introduced what he's termed the ELF awareness continuum, and this is to conceptualize a gradual process of raising teachers' ELF awareness. And this concept of a continuum resonates well with similar conceptualizations within the JALT framework, which I'll present next. So Global English's language teaching then emerged from initially from the PhD in 2011. And it's something that we've been working on since, predominantly with my colleague Heath Rose. It was underpinned by earlier ELF scholarship, comparing EFL and ELF, as well as Kanagaraja's shifts in pedagogic practice. We further developed this in 2012, drawing on Richard's elements, 6 elements of the curriculum, so needs analysis, syllabus methodology, assessment and evaluation, 5 then. There are 13 dimensions to this framework, and what we've done here is to provide a framework for curriculum evaluation and design. Now, it's not without its flaws. I've yet to conduct any research on this, but some scholars have started to use this either as a theoretical framework or as a research tool as well. And that's what it was designed for, as well as to inform curriculum design. And you can see here the different 13 dimensions, and we've got traditional ELT and then what a more global English's approach would look like. So it's just to help teachers as well evaluate their curricula, think about the norms represented in their curricula and their materials, and also what a global English's approach may look like as well. We've taken this further by looking at the actual different elements, so the needs analysis, encouraging teachers to think about these through a global English's lens as well. And in our book with CUP, we pose quite a number of questions for teachers to consider. It is important to highlight that needs analysis is central here. It's, you know, the framework is designed to help teachers make informed decisions. It's not to promote a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching English. It's to guide them in thinking about what are the needs of their students. And in some contexts, perhaps, yes, that might be native or whatever that may be called. native English. So I've just given you some examples here of how, I suppose, in a way, we're trying again to bridge this theory-practice divide by giving teachers something more concrete to work with. So an evaluation framework, and then to look at how would this operate in practice? So what are some goals, objectives, some example outcomes as well? And this was just the example I gave at the start of the talk about the importance of ELF strategies. So I won't go into each of these in detail, but we'll have more time in the workshop as well. Okay, so as the field grows, we've got different frameworks, different terminologies, and there's a lot, and that's why I felt it was important to be inclusive and to cover all of these today. But I think it's important to point out that whatever the term, whatever it may be, as Matsuda points out here, each of these different names indicate a different intellectual history and affiliation, but they're more similar to each other than different in their assumptions, visions, and suggested practice. So I started by highlighting that global English aims to be an inclusive paradigm, and it really does. And it's to highlight the shared endeavors of researchers in all of these different fields, and the similarities in the calls for change. So to try and consolidate this work to help move the field forward as well. It is important to note, though, that this vision for change in ELT doesn't suggest that we want to abandon previous practices entirely. So just as Larson Freeman and Anderson, who provide an overview of techniques and principles in language teaching, note, we don't seek to convince readers that one method is superior to another, or that one, there will always be a perfect method. We've had this constant quest in the field of ELT for the best methods over the year, and that's certainly not our goal with JALT, but it's about raising awareness and increasing teachers and also students' choices as well, not reducing them. And I think that's an important point to make. So it's an ideology which is intended to inform rather than direct teaching in the 21st century. So in order to instigate this shift, I've also started to look at the curriculum innovation literature. When I identified the JALT proposals, I also identified what I termed at the time JALT barriers. So testing, the lack of materials, teacher education programs, attachments to standard language ideology. And I've done some work trying to address each of these, but it is important to note that barriers to innovation will always do exist, and they'll also differ according to the context as well. So this is our innovation framework, which I promise is not as complicated as it looks here. Back in the 1990s, Brown drew on Rogers' diffusion of innovation model to conceptualize the processes by which World English's ideas could be implemented into ELT practices. So I've gone back to this and developed it. And in this framework here, we've drawn on Rogers' different aspects of innovation: compatibility, relative advantage, complexity, triability, observability, and I'll talk more about those. We've also drawn on Fullen's 3 broad phases of introducing an innovation, and here we've come up to 4 steps. So first, on the left, I don't know what happens when it's flipped, we have the knowledge and persuasion phase, and this is where there's exposure to the innovation. Then there's an initiation phase or a decision phase, and it's important that the innovation may be rejected then, or it may be continued onto the implementation phase, which is stage 3, where there's an attempt to put this into practice. And then there's stage 4, the institutionalization phase, and this is where we attempt to achieve innovation sustainability. In this figure, we've tried to show how innovation in curricula, ELT, is not linear, but it's a cyclical process. So rejection can happen at any stage in the cycle. And we need more research on when rejection is happening of global English's innovation and why it's happening and how it's been implemented and what context it's been implemented. We also need to emphasize that this institutionalization phase, stage 4, may appear last chronologically, but its research at this stage is crucial. This is the needs analysis, and where we look at resources, teacher education, Ministry of Education guidelines as well. So can this exist within the host fabric of the educational institution? So even though the institutional phase comes last here, we very much need research here from the outset. So we also emphasize in this model that there's a number of different factors that can influence education innovation, and these include the barriers to change. But we need researchers to trial these innovations and to report on the effects of the innovations, but also the innovation process at different stages as well. Again, this model is not without its flaws, so please do, I would welcome critical comments. It's relatively new, and I guess I've just really started thinking about this innovation process and how to achieve change and drawing on the curriculum innovation literature. So I really do welcome comments on all of this as well. Okay, so I've got 10 minutes, good, I'm on track. So what innovations then have been trialled? So as I mentioned then, recent years have seen a number of increased studies that attempt to bridge this theory-practice divide in global Englishes. Teachers are often seen as agents of change. They've been a real focus of ELF research as well, but many researchers have also focused on the role of teacher education. It's here that we plant the seeds of innovation, if you like. So as we can see here then, in our systematic review, there's some studies in this field reporting on innovation. I should highlight here that there's a number of studies in book chapters. These were not included in the systematic review for a number of reasons, but it is important to highlight that, you know, this is not, there's a lot more studies than what I have here. But of those in the systematic review, our initial screening highlighted that many provide a good overview of instructional activities and modules, which is great, you know, so we can gain an insight into what's happening in these courses, and this can help inform curriculum development and teacher education. But these studies weren't included in this review either, because we've only focused here on empirical studies. Two of the studies here were pilot studies working with small data sets. And the data analysis procedures of one of these articles here was not well articulated. It was quite unclear to see how the data was collected and how it was analysed. So we came to the conclusion here that this work is very much in a pilot stage. The majority of these papers really reflect research in progress pieces. And it is quite surprising, really, given that there's been calls for innovations in teacher education for decades, yet this research seems to be in a pilot stage, really. And we can also see from this table that there's a real need for research in other parts of the globe as well. And also the studies mostly draw on world Englishes as well, which is quite interesting. I'm only giving you little snippets of some of the main findings. So with regards to studies in actual classrooms, we found 17 studies. You can see here the number being conducted in Japan, which is quite interesting. So 17 studies, there were others again that reported on innovative practices, but these didn't have a clear research design. They offered insights, but not a clear empirical research design, so they were excluded. What we can see here that this earliest studies in our sample were Robbie Marlino's study in 2013 in Australia, and then my own studies in Japan. We had studies reported in 12 different countries, and Japan represented in 6 of these, and undergraduate university context represented the vast majority. I've just given you a couple of examples. So this was one of the studies in Japan. This was presentations with students. This was at the university I was working in Japan, where I had the which English, World Englishes course. My colleague and I later analysed some of the poems that the students generated in this course. We also had a listening journal activity as well, and we've been trying to write up all of this, all of these different innovations just to reach a wide practitioner audience as well. One of these studies was also a quasi-experimental design, so looking at the impact of the course on students' overall attitudes. And you can see here, Mammy, before going to Australia, I thought like Canadian English, American English, British English is English. But really, there's many other kinds of English I realise in Australia. So Australia really opened your eyes. My homestay from Malaysia, but they immigrated in Australia, so they can speak English very fluently, but they look Asian, so I'm impressed. How? Do you think most Japanese students would be surprised by that? Yes, I think so. Most Japanese think American and British English is English, so haha, that's why. So here, the course really encouraged Mammy to think about the ELF experience that she's had, how she was using English, who she was using English with, and also to reflect on her attitudes towards English as well. And it was received really positively. I really enjoyed it. It's quite nice looking back to some of your old students' comments as well. So some studies, like the one I've just given an example of then, have reported the direct instruction of teaching global Englishes. I don't have time to go into all of these in detail today, but if you look down the research design ones here, you'll see that despite an increase in research, as we can see in the table, the studies are predominantly qualitative. There's only one quantitative and one mixed method design present. They're predominantly action research projects led by teacher researchers or case studies. Now, I am not belittling action research in any way whatsoever, but it is interesting that it's researchers conducting research within their own classroom. Interestingly, none of these studies labeled as action research referred to action research methodological designs, which is also something that warrants more attention. They didn't track modifications to innovations over time. And they really just offer, I don't mean just, but they offer snapshots of the effects of innovation based on the data collected after the completion of the task, not before. So we don't really see the influence of the intervention. Only 3 of these studies had a longitudinal design, and only 5 provide evidence of the innovation in multiple classrooms. As I mentioned at the start, a lot of these studies purport to claim that their innovations change attitudes and knowledge, but very few of these had concrete instrumentation to actually measure this. And this lack of direct measures of change is quite unfortunate, and I think is something that needs to be addressed in the field as we move forward. Got a couple of minutes, I should be fine. Technology then, and I'll focus on this more on Monday with the network. Given the increased use of online teaching and technology-mediated pedagogy, particularly in current times, we also reviewed some research related to technology. Again, I don't have time to go into these in detail, but you can see some of the methods used. And again, we see a lot of work being conducted in the Japanese context. I think that we have much more access and ability for technology to reveal valuable insights. But there's still not that many studies at the moment focusing on technological innovations, but I do think this perhaps will change in the next year or so. Okay, so just to conclude then, in this talk today, I've given a brief overview of the growing interest in the pedagogical implications of global Englishes and introduced some of the most relevant studies conducted in the past 9 years, actually looking at how to implement this in the classroom. But I think when reviewing the literature and also setting a future research agenda, it's helpful to frame this discussion within Rogers' 5 factors of innovation diffusion. So I think we have to look here is at the relative advantage. Is Global Englishes research demonstrating a perceived benefit of a Global Englishes approach over existing methods? The compatibility, is research exploring the compatibility of new innovations with existing beliefs, practices, contexts? The complexity, this is another one of his 5 factors of innovation. Is our research highlighting ways to make these innovations simpler to implement? And triability, are we exploring the ease at which they can be put into practice, giving people a chance to try them out perhaps first? And also observability, are our findings from our research easily observable for both researcher and practitioner communities? And this relates to a point I made at the start about thinking about where to publish work as well, and also in to highlight the importance of practitioner-orientated journals. So what areas then need to be explored? I think we need more work then on the effects of curriculum interventions. We need more explicit research into teacher education, more work into the attitudes and learners towards these suggested changes. So I've started doing some work with teachers' attitudes towards the proposals being put forward in the literature. Much more work on technology. And I think we also need to share our work and ensure that it's accessible for a wide audience. And that led me to set up the network that I'll present in the workshop on Monday. This is an online community of practice. We have over 70 coordinators from around the globe. We have a Global English strand and an EMI strand. We have many blog interviews, research reviews. The idea is that to increase the impact of our work, to showcase what's happening at the doctoral level with our early career researchers, for our early career researchers to network, to discuss their methodology with each other, and also for us to host a number of events as well. I'll present more about this on Monday, so I won't go into this in detail because that is now 12 o'clock. I'm surprised I managed to get through everything in the hour. But if you're interested in the network, joining up and learning more about it, we'll have quite an interactive workshop on Monday. But thank you very much for listening to me for an entire hour.